Imagine living in a world where freedom was only a distant dream, and every step outside the slave quarters could mean eternal pain. Today, you are going to learn about one of the cruelest practices of slavery, the tactic of mutilation used to prevent the enslaved from escaping their masters. Before we continue, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because here we reveal truths that history tried to hide. What you are about to hear is not in school textbooks, but it echoes in the scars left by the whip, the branding iron, and the iron chains that mark generations. Get ready, because this is a story of pain, resistance, and memory that needs to be told. The system of slavery in Brazil and in so many other parts of the world was built not only with iron chains and shackles, but above all with the most powerful weapon of all, fear. Fear was the foundation of the entire operation of the big house. It upheld the authority of the master, gave the overseer the right to use the whip, and kept the slave quarters silent despite so much suffering. It was a calculated fear, planned and applied as a strategy of domination. And every act of violence was designed not only to punish, but to serve as an example to anyone who dared to imagine escape or rebellion. In the big house, the masters lived in luxury and privilege, but they knew their power depended on the obedience of the enslaved. That is why they delegated to the overseer the role of watching and punishing. He was the right hand of cruelty, the one who walked through the plantation with a whip in hand, ready to crack it across the back of anyone who slowed down. The whipping post, often placed in plain sight, was the place where bodies were tied and displayed, not only to inflict physical pain, but to turn punishment into a spectacle of humiliation. The slave quarters, in turn, were not just the place of forced rest after long days. They were also the space where the torment of the night became routine. With every moan from wounds opened by the whip, the realization grew that there was no easy way out. It was in the darkness of the quarters that fear multiplied, passed down from generation to generation, shaping the behavior of the enslaved and suffocating any attempt at rebellion. The mud and wooden walls held not only tired bodies, but also secrets of violence and pain. The pillory, set up in public squares, was the stage for the most explicit demonstration of this collective fear. There, in front of the community, overseers and slave masters turned pain into spectacle. Each lash tore not only the skin, but also dignity, and the crowd, often forced to watch, learned that disobedience came at a high price. The pillory was a symbol of the master's absolute power, a constant reminder that escape or revolt were not safe paths. Fear was so effective that it stretched across days and nights. The torment of the night, when enslaved people were punished after work, had an even more devastating psychological effect. After long, exhausting hours in the fields, they were forced to endure pain under the cold moon while their companions watched. Thus, slavery relied not only on chains, but also on the very shadows of the night to reinforce terror. Enslaved women felt this fear in an even more brutal way. Beyond the constant risk of physical mutilation, they suffered sexual violence inside the slave quarters, in the fields, or even inside the big house. The black woman's body was seen as the property of the master, and this violation also served as a tool of fear. Everyone knew that resistance meant even more brutal punishments. Thus, physical fear and emotional fear intertwined, turning slavery into a total system of terror. The shackles on their feet and the iron chains on their wrists were constant reminders that every movement was under control. They were not only instruments of physical restraint, they were visible symbols of domination. The clinking of iron in the silence of dawn reminded everyone that escape meant the risk of death, mutilation, or punishment at the whipping post. Fear was present in every sound, every shadow, every gesture of the overseers. But fear was not limited to the enslaved. It also served to maintain the social power of the masters. The free white community knew that any loosening of discipline could mean rebellion. That is why the system was reinforced with the complicity of colonial authorities and the church, which often legitimized slavery as something necessary to maintain order. Fear, then, was transformed into politics, into culture, into law. Slavery knew it could not rely only on chains to restrain thousands of people who longed for freedom. That is why it used fear as an invisible chain. Each scar left by the whip was a warning letter carved into flesh, reminding that the system was greater than any individual. Fear shaped not only bodies, but also minds, and it was the first step in maintaining control before harsher punishments were applied. Yet it is important to understand that this fear did not extinguish the flame of resistance. On the contrary, it often intensified it, because the more cruel the repression, the stronger the desire for freedom became. And to contain that desire, the masters resorted to even more extreme practices, designed not only to injure, but to permanently disable. That was when mutilation became not only a punishment, but a planned strategy to prevent escapes. Fear upheld the system, but it was not enough. When the whip, the post, and the pillory no longer guaranteed obedience, the masters turned to even more brutal methods. In the next chapter, we will understand how the practice of mutilation emerged and why it became one of the most ruthless weapons of slavery. Slavery, from its earliest documented forms, has always used violence as a tool of control. But when we talk about slavery in Brazil and other colonies in the Americas, we realize that cruelty took on proportions that went far beyond temporary physical punishment. Mutilation was born as a planned mechanism designed to turn bodies into examples of forced obedience. Its origin is directly tied to the slave trade, the slave ships, and the practices imported from Europe, which were adapted and intensified in the colonial context. The slave ship was the first setting where many enslaved Africans experienced systematic brutality. Crowded into dark holds, chained with shackles and iron chains, men and women were treated as fragile yet valuable commodities. Any attempt to escape during the crossing, or even the smallest act of defiance, could be answered with swift mutilations, cutting off ears, fingers, or branding the body with hot iron. The torment began at sea, and the Atlantic Ocean became a silent witness to marked bodies long before they ever set foot in the slave quarters of the Big House. These practices had roots in the punitive culture of medieval Europe itself. In earlier centuries, thieves and deserters were branded with hot irons or had limbs amputated as a way to identify and humiliate them. When Portuguese and Spanish colonizers brought these methods to the colonies, they adapted them to the logic of the slave system. The enslaved body became not only an instrument of labor, but also a canvas for power. Each mark, each mutilation, was a reminder of who held authority. The pillory, already used in Portugal as a site of public punishment, was installed in various colonial towns and cities. There, before the community, mutilations became not just punishment, but spectacle. The master did not want only to punish. He also wanted to show other enslaved people that running away or resisting would have irreversible consequences. Mutilation was not carried out in secret. It was exposed, displayed, and transformed into a theater of terror. With the growth of the sugar economy in Brazil, escapes increased. Plantations expanded, slave quarters housed hundreds of men and women, and constant surveillance by the overseer was no longer enough. In this context, mutilation became consolidated as an official strategy. Amputating a foot prevented an enslaved person from running. Cutting off an ear made them easily identifiable. Branding with hot iron stamped the master's ownership on the body. These acts were not outbursts of anger, but coldly calculated decisions meant to discourage any attempt at freedom. Accounts from European travelers who passed through Brazil and other colonies described these practices with horror. Some spoke of enslaved people who, after trying to escape, returned with their hands cut off. Others reported men and women branded on the face, forever carrying the scar of a glowing iron. The torment of the night, so common in the slave quarters, often included mutilations applied slowly, so that the pain was prolonged and served as an example to all who watched. Enslaved women were not spared from this cruelty. Often, beyond the sexual violence inflicted by masters, they were mutilated as punishment for resisting or trying to protect their children. The mutilation of the female body carried a symbolic function as well. It struck not only the woman, but the entire community, showing that not even the womb that bore new life was safe. Thus, mutilation became a weapon of physical, psychological, and social control. It is important to understand that this practice did not arise in isolation, but as part of a deeply structured system of slavery. The overseer had direct authority to apply punishments, but many times the masters ordered exemplary punishments, especially in cases of attempted escape. Mutilation was recorded as a form of legal property. That body, even wounded, remained a labor force and a symbol of submission. Over time, mutilation took on a preventive role. It was no longer only a response to escape, but a constant threat. Enslaved people knew that if they tried to run and were captured, they might never walk, work, or embrace their children the same way again. The fear of mutilation walked hand in hand with the sound of the whip, the shadow of the whipping post, and the presence of the pillory in the center of colonial towns. It was a network of terror built to ensure that few dared challenge the system. The torment of mutilation was therefore more than just a technique of violence. It became part of colonial culture, an institution of fear, and unlike other punishments which could heal over time, mutilation left permanent, visible, and irreversible marks. It turned the enslaved body into a walking reminder of the master's power, reinforcing daily the dominance of the big house over the slave quarters. But even in the face of such cruelty, there was resistance. Many mutilated enslaved people still tried to escape, proving that the thirst for freedom was greater than the pain. Some found refuge in quilombos, others were welcomed by supportive communities. These examples show that no matter how brutal, mutilation never managed to completely erase the desire for freedom. If the origin of mutilation reveals how it became a strategy of power, the next step is to understand in detail what the most common forms of this punishment were. In the next chapter, we will explore the mutilations most frequently applied, from the use of hot iron to the cuts that made escape almost impossible. When the whip, the post, and the pillory were no longer enough to contain the desire for freedom, masters and overseers turned to something even more cruel: permanent mutilations. Their goal was not only to punish, but to physically prevent escape. The enslaved body, turned into both an instrument of labor and a stage of violence, was marked forever. There was no return, no healing, only visible and deep scars that bore witness to the pain of an inhuman system. One of the most common practices was cutting off ears. This punishment had a double effect. On the one hand, it worked as a visible mark. Anyone could identify a fugitive enslaved person by the absence of an ear. On the other, it was an act of humiliation, since it disfigured the face and exposed the victim to public mockery. An enslaved person who tried to escape and was captured would rarely go unnoticed after such mutilation. They carried forever the proof of their disobedience, engraved on their own face. Another frequent type was the amputation of fingers from hands or feet. Fingers, so small in size but essential for life, were cut off to limit mobility and the ability to escape. Cutting toes made running difficult. Cutting fingers impaired work, but kept the body partially useful for lighter tasks. In this way, the master kept his property alive, though reduced to a symbol of fear. This mutilation turned every step into pain and every movement into a reminder of forced submission. The amputation of entire feet or hands was applied in extreme cases. Enslaved people who ran away repeatedly were punished in this way. Without feet, escape became practically impossible. Without hands, work was limited, but the body still served as a public humiliation to show all others the price of freedom. This cruelty had no limits, and each amputation served as a living example inside the slave quarters. The branding iron was perhaps the most striking symbol of this period. Heated until incandescent, it was pressed into the skin to mark the master's property. Some were engraved with initials, others only with signs, but all had the same function: dehumanization. This brand burned into the flesh, filled the air with the smell of charred skin, and left behind a scar that time could never erase. The branding iron was used on arms, backs, chests, and even faces, leaving the victim forever identifiable. It was a torment that combined pain, fear, and eternal memory. Shackles and iron chains were also instruments of indirect mutilation. Heavy and tight, they wounded wrists and ankles, causing deep cuts that often turned into chronic sores. Rust penetrated the skin, leaving marks that did not always heal. The clinking of chains was more than the sound of imprisonment. It was a constant warning that every step was watched, every movement controlled. Over the years, these chains deformed bones and muscles, turning the enslaved body into a living witness of cruelty. The whip, although not mutilation in the sense of amputation, produced permanent effects. Each strike tore the skin, and scars accumulated until the back became a map of pain. The marks left by the whip were not only physical, they were also psychological. Daily reminders that rebellion cost blood. In many cases, wounds reopened with the sweat of forced labor, and the enslaved carried these scars until death. Some accounts even speak of more extreme mutilations, applied in cases considered exemplary by masters. There are records of enslaved men castrated, especially those accused of having relations with white women from the big house, or even with enslaved women considered the exclusive property of the master. This mutilation was one of the most brutal because it destroyed not only the body, but also the identity and dignity of the man. It turned him into a symbol of impotence before a system that knew no limits in imposing fear. In the slave quarters, the torment of the night often included the exposure of these mutilations. The enslaved were forced to watch the suffering of their companions, while the overseer proudly displayed the result of the branding iron or the knife that severed limbs. The objective was clear: to turn individual pain into a collective lesson. The slave quarters, already marked by darkness and silence, became even more suffocating in the face of these demonstrations of power. The pillory, in turn, was the stage where these mutilations were exhibited in broad daylight. There in the central square, before masters, overseers, and enslaved people, the mutilated body was raised as an example. Each lash, each cut, each scream was absorbed by the crowd as a message: freedom has a price you cannot pay. The pillory was thus not only a place of pain, but a monument of terror erected to perpetuate submission. These mutilations were not accidents, nor sudden outbursts of anger. They were systematic practices, organized and planned as part of a policy of social control. The master knew that by mutilating one, he controlled 100. The marked body became a living advertisement of the big house's authority, and the slave quarters learned that escape could mean losing part of oneself. Even so, many enslaved people did not give up. They fled mutilated, dragging chains, running without toes, walking with wounded feet. They sought quilombos, pursued freedom even knowing the chances were slim. These examples of courage show that no matter how cruel mutilation was, it never erased the fire of resistance. The scar was not only a reminder of pain, but also a testimony of a struggle greater than life itself. Now that we understand how mutilations were carried out, we must reflect on their deeper meaning. They were not only individual wounds, but part of a system that turned pain into spectacle. In the next chapter, we will analyze how cruelty also had a social function: to intimidate, humiliate, and reinforce the slave system before the entire community. Slavery was not sustained only by the brute force of the whip or by the iron chains that bound wrists and ankles. It was also a spectacle, carefully staged so that each act of violence had an audience. The enslaved body, marked at the whipping post, exposed at the pillory, or wounded in the torment of the night, became the stage for a cruel message. Obedience was mandatory, and disobedience came at a high cost. Cruelty, therefore, had a social function: to ensure that everyone, from the slave quarters to the big house, saw and learned from the pain of others. In the center of colonial towns and cities, the pillory rose as a monument of humiliation. There, before the entire community, the overseer tied men and women to receive punishment. The master, often accompanied by family members, observed the scene with a cold gaze, reaffirming his authority before everyone else. The pillory was not only an instrument of punishment, it was a public symbol of social order. There, whipped, mutilated, or branded bodies became living posters of the supremacy of the big house over the slave quarters. Punishments were rarely carried out in secret. On the contrary, they were organized so that the greatest number of people could watch. Pain served not only to wound the body, but to feed collective fear. Each scream echoed as a warning, each drop of blood fell as a lesson. The slave quarters were forced to witness the scene so that all would understand that escape or rebellion were paths with no return. Individual torment was transformed into a communal ritual of obedience. This theatricalization of violence also had the function of legitimizing the master's power before white society. By punishing in public, the master demonstrated that he controlled not only his property, but also the social order around him. The overseer, whip in hand, became an extension of that power, and those who watched, merchants, neighbors, even priests, reinforced the system by remaining silent before cruelty. Thus the pillory was more than a stone column. It was a stage where the hierarchy of slavery was acted out day after day. The torment of the night also fulfilled this social function, though in a more restricted setting. Inside the slave quarters, where darkness hid tired bodies, punishments were applied to remind everyone that the power of the big house never slept. The overseer appeared like a shadow among the captives, and anyone could be taken to the improvised whipping post. The absence of light reinforced the terror, and the groans pierced the mud walls as a warning to all who heard. Night, which should have brought rest, became the continuation of the spectacle of pain. Sexual violence against enslaved women was also part of this logic. Many times abuses did not occur in secret, but in front of the community, as a way to humiliate not only the woman, but all the men and women of the slave quarters. The message was clear: neither the female body nor motherhood nor intimacy were protected. This cruelty reinforced the idea of the master's absolute possession, and its social function was to break collective dignity. It is essential to understand that this spectacle of violence was an indispensable cog in maintaining the system. The master knew that shackles alone were not enough. The mind also had to be imprisoned, and the mind was imprisoned through fear, through the memory of witnessed scenes, through the scars seen on friends and relatives. Terror became more effective when shared, when transformed into public spectacle. The social function of cruelty, therefore, was not only to punish those who erred, but to teach those who watched. Each punishment was a collective lesson, each mutilation a story told without words. The slave quarters learned with their eyes, and the big house reaffirmed its dominance with every tear shed. Violence in this context was language, a cruel language, but one understood by all. This theatricalization of pain also had a devastating psychological effect. Many enslaved people, upon seeing companions mutilated, came to believe that escape was impossible. The image of a body branded with hot iron or of a man without hands became a recurring ghost, haunting the mind before any attempt at resistance. The system knew this and used the spectacle as a mental weapon, imprisoning even those who had never been directly punished. Yet even in the face of such cruelty, there were signs of silent resistance. Some enslaved people, forced to watch, looked at the mutilated not only with fear, but with compassion and anger. These feelings, though contained, fed the flame of rebellion. The social function of cruelty may have been effective in maintaining order, but it also planted the seed of revolt. Each scar displayed in the public square was both a reminder of pain and an inspiration for struggle. Thus, cruelty played a contradictory role. It sustained the system, but revealed its brutality. The pillory, the slave quarters, the whipping post, and the torment of the night formed a dark theater where the roles were clearly defined. But behind the tears and screams, the desire to break free from that reality also grew. If cruelty fulfilled this social function of terror and control, it was still not capable of completely suffocating the spirit of freedom. In the next chapter, we will see how, even mutilated and persecuted, many enslaved people found strength to resist and escape, building quilombos and stories of courage that defied the power of the big house. No matter how much the big house with its masters tried to impose authority through the whip, the whipping post, the pillory, the iron chains, and the branding iron, there was something impossible to imprison: the desire for freedom. That desire pulsed in the heart of every man and woman in the slave quarters. It grew in the silence of the nights, in the shared torment, in the scars left by shackles, and it was transformed into courage, even in the face of mutilation and death. Many enslaved people planned their escapes patiently, taking advantage of gaps in the overseer's surveillance. Some risked it alone, running through the forests with wounded feet and scarred bodies. Others fled in groups, forming small communities that sought survival far from the big house. Even mutilated, without toes, with ears cut off, or with the marks of a branding iron burning into their skin, they still found the strength to try to escape. These flights were demonstrations that resistance was stronger than terror. The quilombos were born from this spirit. They were free communities formed by men and women who had escaped the slave quarters and the torments of the whipping post and pillory. The most famous Zumbi dos Palmares became a symbol of resistance. Located in Serra da Barriga, it sheltered thousands of people and resisted for almost a century. There, under the leadership of Zumbi, the mutilated and the branded regained their lost dignity, rebuilding families, cultures, and dreams of freedom. Palmares was living proof that whips and shackles were not enough to break the soul of a people. But not every escape had a grand destiny like the quilombos. Many were desperate attempts to find shelter in forests, rivers, or even neighboring farms. Mutilated enslaved people dragged themselves along with wounded feet. Women fled carrying children in their arms, facing hunger, wild animals, and the pursuit of slave catchers. These stories, though less well known, are equally heroic because they reveal that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The torment of the night, the marks of the branding iron, and the weight of shackles never erased hope. Enslaved women played a fundamental role in this resistance. Beyond enduring sexual violence inside both the big house and the slave quarters, they risked their lives by escaping with their children, protecting their family's future. Many found refuge in quilombos, where they raised free children, breaking the cycle of pain imposed by the masters. Their escapes were acts of courage that challenged not only physical violence, but also the social structure that insisted on treating them as property. Faith was another central element of resistance. In the slave quarters, during the torment of the night, many enslaved people sang chants, prayed, and beat drums that brought spiritual strength. These practices, inherited from Africa, kept cultural identity alive and gave courage to face overseers and masters. Even when the whip tore their backs or the branding iron burned their flesh, there was conviction that freedom was a promise greater than any pain. Faith was a refuge, but also a silent weapon against dehumanization. The accounts of enslaved people who escaped even after mutilations are still striking today. Some, without feet, crawled through the forest until they found shelter. Others, with severed hands, were welcomed into quilombo communities and became living examples of resistance. These stories show that no matter how efficient the social function of cruelty was, it never managed to extinguish the flame of freedom. Each marked body was also a witness to a struggle that spanned generations. Resistance was not limited to escape. There were also organized rebellions in which groups of enslaved people rose up against overseers and masters. Many of these revolts ended in massacres, with bodies displayed at the pillory as warnings. But the mere fact that they happened already proved that the system was never passively accepted. The fear imposed by the whipping post, the lash, and the iron chains was not enough to silence the voice of hope. These attempts at escape and resistance were whispers of humanity amid dehumanization. Every step outside the slave quarters was a declaration. We do not accept chains. Every quilombo raised in the forests was a victory against the torment imposed by the big house. Every mutilated person who dared to challenge destiny proved that freedom was stronger than fear. The masters, perceiving this resistance, reinforced their strategies of terror. The overseer doubled his vigilance, shackles became heavier, the branding iron more frequent. But none of this erased the fact that slavery was constantly threatened by the courage of those who refused to accept submission. The system survived, but at the cost of increasingly brutal violence. The memory of these escapes and acts of resistance is fundamental. They show that the enslaved were not only victims but protagonists of their own history. The whip, the pillory, and the whipping post may have wounded their bodies, but they did not silence their will to live free. Every quilombo, every escape, every act of courage was a step in the long march that would one day culminate in the end of slavery. If resistance was able to survive even mutilations and iron chains, we now need to understand the psychological and cultural impact left by this system. In the next chapter, we will reflect on how pain became a scar not only on the body, but also on the soul, shaping generations who lived under the weight of torment and humiliation. The scars of slavery were not only on bodies marked by the whip, the branding iron, shackles, and iron chains. They crossed time and became fixed in the minds and souls of those who lived in the slave quarters, carrying the torment of the night as a daily reminder. Each mutilation, each punishment at the whipping post, each public exposure at the pillory did not strike only the individual, but the entire community, creating a collective trauma that shaped culture, self-esteem, and even relationships between generations. The torment left invisible marks. The constant fear of being taken to the whipping post or the pillory corroded trust and hope. Men whose hands had been cut off or women branded with hot iron suffered not only physical pain, but also the weight of imposed shame. The mutilated body became a symbol of submission, and the sense of helplessness came to inhabit the entire slave quarters. This psychological suffering was so deep that many preferred to risk their lives escaping rather than remain prisoners of endless fear. Enslaved women bore yet another form of mutilation: sexual violence. Forced to satisfy the desires of masters inside the big house or even in front of the community, they were violated not only in body, but in dignity. These assaults left emotional wounds that were transmitted from mother to daughter, creating a cycle of pain that spanned generations. The children of abuse, often rejected by masters, grew up without belonging, inheriting a trauma that was not theirs, but that marked their identity. In the slave quarters, nights were filled with forced silence. The torment of the night, with screams of pain echoing in the darkness, planted in everyone's heart the fear of being next. This environment shaped a culture of survival in which apparent obedience was a strategy of resistance. Silence, often interpreted as submission, was also a form of psychological protection. People learned to remain quiet to avoid further suffering, and that silence became cultural inheritance. The scars also shaped spirituality. Many enslaved people, facing the whip and the branding iron, sought strength in their African traditions or in the faith imposed by the colonizer. Religion became a refuge against psychological pain. Songs, dances, and prayers became forms of emotional resistance, capable of turning the slave quarters into spaces of hope, even when surrounded by iron chains and watched by the overseer. This spirituality was passed on as culture, preserving the memory of resistance in the face of brutality. Another profound impact was internalized dehumanization. When a man was branded on the face or a woman's body was exposed at the pillory, everyone around learned to see the enslaved as something lesser. Over time, this vision imposed by the masters infiltrated even among the captives themselves, creating internal divisions. Enslaved people born in Brazil were often encouraged to feel superior to those newly arrived on slave ships. This cultural manipulation was part of the strategy of control, but it left scars of disunity that persisted long beyond the end of slavery. Public humiliation at the pillory also had a devastating effect on collective self-esteem. Enslaved children grew up seeing their fathers tied, their mothers punished, their uncles mutilated. That childhood, marked by pain, created generations who carried trauma as identity. Even when free, many descendants still felt the invisible weight of chains, as if the slave quarters had taken root inside their minds. It was a psychological prison that crossed centuries. Physical mutilations were also cultural mutilations. Cutting off a hand or an ear was not just about limiting the body, it was about injuring important symbols of identity. Hands that played drums and African instruments were silenced. Ears that once heard the chants of ancestral memory were torn away. The enslaved body, turned into a stage of torment, was also a cultural space destroyed. This violence not only dehumanized, but also attempted to erase entire traditions. Psychological trauma also manifested in the relationship with freedom itself. Many enslaved people, even after gaining manumission, continued to live under the weight of fear. The sound of a whip, the sight of a branding iron, or even the simple touch of an iron chain awakened memories of pain. This persistent fear crossed through life, showing that slavery did not end with the fall of the slave quarters, but remained in memories and the unconscious. Culturally, the legacy of slavery produced both pain and resistance. On one hand, there were emotional scars. On the other, creativity flourished as a way to overcome trauma. Music, dance, religion, and solidarity among the enslaved were cultural responses to torment. Every song sung, every rhythm created was more than art. It was psychological healing, silent resistance against the mutilation of the soul. These consequences, visible and invisible, show that slavery was more than an economic system based on the big house and the slave quarters. It was a war against human dignity, waged not only on the body, but also on the mind. The whipping post, the pillory, The lash, the branding iron, and the shackles were weapons on one side. Memory, faith, and culture were weapons on the other. And even though the scars still echo, cultural resistance proved that humanity cannot be mutilated forever. If psychological and cultural trauma shows how slavery left deep scars, it is time to understand how these marks turned into memory and heritage. In the next chapter, we will see how the silence of the slave quarters and the screams of the pillory still echo today, reminding us of the importance of preserving history so that cruelty is never repeated. The marks of slavery did not remain only on bodies punished by the whip, the branding iron, the shackles, or the iron chains. They crossed centuries and turned into collective memory, into cultural heritage that still shapes the identity of millions of descendants of those who lived in the slave quarters and suffered under the power of the big house. The torment of the night, the whipping post, and the pillory may have disappeared physically, but their echoes remain in social structures and in the racism that still insists on surviving. The mutilated body of yesterday has become a symbol of resistance today. Each scar left by the masters and inflicted under the watch of overseers became a historical testimony. The memory of these torments, transmitted through generations, helps us understand that slavery was not only an economic system, but also a profound attack on human dignity. To remember these violences is an act of justice, because every mark on the skin of an enslaved person is also a mark on the history of Brazil and the world. The legacy of slavery is present in culture. The songs sung in the slave quarters, created to relieve the weight of shackles and silence the suffering of the whipping post, survived as hymns of resistance. The beating of drums, which echoed during the torment of the night, was transformed into rhythms that today are part of a people's cultural identity. The memory of pain was redefined into art, into faith, into struggle. It is proof that even in the face of attempts to erase traditions, culture endured as a living heritage. But we cannot romanticize suffering. The memory of slavery is also a memory of pain. The pillory in the squares, where men and women were once exposed, still today causes silence in the cities that preserve their stone columns. For many descendants, walking past an old pillory is to feel the weight of generations who wept in that same place. This heritage is made of tears, and remembering it is a historical obligation. Enslaved women left behind an even more complex memory. Violated in the big house, forced to bear children of abuse, they often lost the possibility of building free families. This violence crossed time and became an inherited pain for their descendants. The female body, used as a battlefield of slavery, still carries the weight of a memory marked by forced submission. At the same time, it also represents strength and resilience, because many of these women found ways to resist and protect their children even in the midst of torment. Structural racism is one of the cruelest legacies left by slavery. It is the modern echo of shackles, iron chains, and branding irons. If once the slave quarters imprisoned bodies, today social inequalities continue to limit opportunities. The memory of slavery lives on in every act of discrimination, in every silent exclusion, in every prejudice still practiced. That is why remembering is not only about looking back, it is about recognizing the invisible chains that persist in the present. Cultural heritage, however, is also made of resistance. The quilombos, which were born as refugees for the mutilated and the fugitives, became communities that still exist, preserving traditions and memories of freedom. They are living witnesses that torment did not prevail. The memory of the quilombos keeps the flame of struggle alive, showing that the legacy of slavery is also a legacy of courage and victory against the big house system. Every scar, every song, every memory is part of a history that cannot be erased. The memory of slavery is a heritage that demands responsibility. We must tell it, teach it, and transmit it so that future generations understand the value of freedom. The pillory today may stand empty, the whipping post may have rotted away, but the screams of the past still echo in our streets and in our consciences. If the memory and heritage of slavery still live among us, the question we must ask is, how do we transform this remembrance into commitment? In the conclusion, we will reflect on what it means to carry these scars today and why it is urgent to keep history alive so that it never repeats itself.